Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 13th of March 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Gerrish and Mike Robinson. Run, hide, tell.
The Russians are coming.
The Russians are coming.
Well, yesterday we said something about the likely statement from Theresa May regarding the nerve agent that was allegedly used to attack Mr. Skripal and his daughter. Let's just remind ourselves what we said.
Here's Reuters. Britain sends specialist troops to city where Russian double agent poisoned. We haven't yet had a declaration of what the poison is, but it's pretty serious stuff because you've got to wash your clothes.
I might be able to tell you what the poison is.
Okay.
I have it on good authority that there's a good possibility that it'll be announced imminently. That the poison detected was called Novichok, and this is probably going to be, we're going to be told that only a Russian lab could have produced this stuff. It's an organophosphate. It's allegedly was produced by the Russians. In fact, it was discussed by them apparently in open literature from the 1960s to the 80s. But the point here is that really any lab or any organic chemist or any lab could make reasonable quantities of this stuff, but the implication is going to be that could only have come from Russia. So that was at 1 o'clock yesterday afternoon, and at around, I think it was around 4:30 or so, or maybe a little bit later, but several hours later, this is what Theresa May had to say.
This morning I chaired a meeting of the National Security Council in which we considered the information so far available. As is normal, the Council was updated on the assessment and intelligence picture, as well as the state of the investigation. It is now clear that Mr. Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with a military-grade nerve agent of a type developed by Russia. This is part of a group of nerve agents known as Novichok. Based on the positive identification of this chemical agent by world-leading experts at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory at Porton Down, our knowledge that Russia has previously produced this agent and would still be capable of doing so, Russia's record of conducting state-sponsored assassinations, and our assessment that Russia views some defectors as legitimate targets for assassinations, the government has concluded that it is highly likely that Russia was responsible for the act against Sergei and Yulia Skripal. Mr. Speaker, there are therefore only two plausible explanations for what happened in Salisbury on the 4th of March. Either this was a direct act by the Russian state against our country, or the Russian government lost control of its potentially catastrophically damaging nerve agent and allowed it to get into the hands of others.
So only two possible explanations, Brian. We won't worry about the possible explanation that since this was effectively public knowledge how to produce this stuff, that maybe it might have been produced in Porton Down, for example. We're not going to worry about that because that's not a possibility.
Or that it was produced in a country other than Russia.
Like Ukraine, for example, which is absolutely possible. But
or that the British government is simply lying over the whole affair.
These don't count. These possibilities, there are only two possibilities.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, she went on to say that
this morning I chaired a meeting of...
Apologies for that. She went on to say this. Mr. Speaker, on Wednesday we will consider in detail the response from the Russian state. She said, should there be no credible response, we will conclude that this action amounts to an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom. And I will come back to the House and set out the full range of measures that we'll take in response. So threats, we'll come on to what the potential actual response will be in a second. This is what Sergei Lavrov had to say. We will not respond. Pretty much that was it. He said they're talking nonsense. He was surprised isn't the right word. He was commenting this morning on the fact that almost every single member of the government was coming out with these lies, and that's pretty much what he was calling them. But he's saying if Theresa May's expecting a response, they're not going to get one. Theresa May, by the way, who was the first person she went off to speak to immediately after this? That was Macron in France, because of course Britain and the French were effectively operating as one country now with merged militaries and all kinds of other cooperation going on. So she had to speak to her sidekick there. But, you know, who is the target of this? Well, I think we believe that the target is going to be RT. I think RT believes that the target is going to be RT because they issued this statement this morning. It's regrettable to see RT so quickly proposed as to be sacrificed as a political pawn in one fell swoop, doing away with any concept of press freedom in the UK. RT serves a valuable role in completing the picture of news for its audience, and it has received multiple awards for its journalism. Such proposals only serve to indicate how much some public figures are willing to turn their backs on their own communities, demonstrating no desire to engage swathes of their own constituents through the channels they choose to adopt for their news. This only serves to increase the exact polarisation in society that is so frequently lamented. We are proud to have a better record with Ofcom than most other UK broadcasters, and any curtailment of RT will ultimately lead to the detriment, or be to the detriment of the British public. It is they who have been turning to RT for years for coverage of vital yet neglected stories and voices, including those of the many MPs and other UK public figures who have been shut out of public discourse by the mainstream media. So that is RT's statement. They see themselves as being threatened by what's going on at the moment. I think they're a very likely target for this.
I think very likely target indeed, Mike. And isn't it interesting that really what Russia Today say is true, that people are turning to Russia Today to get news and information that is clearly not provided by other channels, the BBC in particular. So Russia Today has been successful in picking up an audience because people have started to realise that the BBC itself utter propaganda and government political bias. So they're moving around to look at other sources for their information. And I think we've been picking up very strong hints for over a year that the British government, utterly frightened of the increasing power of Russia Today to get information and facts in front of the British public. They've got to go. We've got a dictatorship forming in UK. You can't have other channels bringing information to expose and criticise the government.
Well, indeed, we'll be talking a bit more about that later on. Now, of course, the allegation from Theresa May, still unproven because she's still very uncertain about whether it was actually the Russians or not, is that the allegation nonetheless is that the Russians have carried out some kind of extrajudicial killing in a foreign country. Britain wouldn't do that, would they?
Well, I think they would, Mike, yeah.
Well, indeed, because here is a report from a couple of years ago, Britain's kill list. Well, let's have a look at some of the comments from this. It says, on September the 7th, 2015, Prime Minister David Cameron came to Parliament and announced a new departure for Britain, quotes, a new departure for Britain, a policy of killing individuals the security services and the military do not like. The pretext for the kill list was terrorism. However, the joint prioritised effective list soon spilled over as British law enforcement was desperate to use the invasion of Afghanistan to attack the Afghan-Pakistan narcotics trail. Thus, targets included drug traffickers, with the war on terror leaking into the war on drugs. Britain as a nation with a collective moral abhorrence of the death penalty, even after a fair trial, especially for non-violent offenders. It is extraordinary then that the JPEL kill list allowed for the execution of narcotics traffickers without a trial at all. So this has been going on for many years. We've got incidences of Britain's use of torture, some cases resulting in people's deaths. We had Gavin Williamson, the Defence Secretary, just saying a few weeks ago that he thought that anybody that had left the UK to go and fight in Syria should be killed without any kind of trial, fair or otherwise. So for Britain to be taking this stand, even were it to be true, which I don't believe for one second, even if were it to be true that Russia was involved in this attempted assassination, the hypocrisy is just unbelievable. It's
unbelievable going down the direction of that kill list, Mike. It's also unbelievable, or let's put it the other way around, totally believable. We've got Britain, of course, involved with chemical weapons and chemical weapon testing on unsuspecting servicemen. at Porton Down itself. So this is the devious nature of the British state, that it was testing nerve agents on its own armed forces. They were being told at the time that they were just doing sort of psychological experiments, some of which included seeing how you reacted if you were being given common cold or influenza bug. And of course, at one stage, the British government was required to pay out quite substantial sums of compensation. But nevertheless, the British government tested nerve agents on its own serving personnel. They also conducted experiments where agents were spread across particularly the south of England, and that resulted in, amongst other things, and I will say alleged, but I've seen some of the evidence which seems pretty conclusive to me, produce cancer clusters, particularly throat cancers, in the southeast of England. So the British government totally complicit in the production and the covert testing of this stuff on its own service people. Really deceitful, wicked behaviour by the British government, the same British government that now, with no evidence, points a finger at the Russians. And of course, the other thing we've got to say is this new agent was deemed to be particularly exciting because it could be produced from relatively easily obtainable chemical substances. So it's a combination of materials that could be readily sourced, and any reasonably capable society is able to produce this toxin. So where is the evidence that the Russians did it?
There isn't any.
Well, what are we going to do? Well, this morning we've heard intimations that they're heading almost in a direction to get NATO on board, that this is almost an attack on the country, it's an attack on the UK, and therefore it's an attack on the whole of NATO. Theresa May, I think, would like to feel that the whole of the NATO countries are going to come in behind her. So particularly bizarre that the Times and Sunday Times is pushing this out. Must read. Vladimir Putin has 18 hours to explain the Salisbury spy poisoning. As Theresa May sets her deadline, we report in our top story that Britain is preparing the ground for a retaliatory cyber attack. This is something out of the Boys' Own Journal or the Beano. I mean, this is just fascinating stuff. But it gets worse, because let's come in at this one, the Telegraph. What's the Telegraph got to say? Well, the Telegraph is going to show us a picture there. This is Salisbury car park ticket machine cordoned off as export warns dusty nerve agent used on Russian spy can linger. I'm having trouble reading some of this stuff because it is utterly so immature and bizarre. So we've suddenly gone back into a car park that the victims may have used. They've suddenly discovered that one of the machines has possibly got lingering traces of this very dangerous nerve agent on it. They've put a coloured tent over it. What's happened to all the people, the members of the public, Mike, who've been near these machines?
Yeah, well, they must be dying in hundreds.
Well, one would have thought so, but of course they have been advised to wash their clothes. So you're slowly dying, but go away and wash your clothes. But if it's washable, if it's not washable, it's dry cleaning clothes, double bag it.
Yeah.
We are to believe that this is sensible. So let's have a look at what was said here. It came as a former chemical weapons inspector warned that the Novichok used in the attack is very persistent and could linger for a reasonable length of time as a, quote, dusty agent. So it's very persistent, and yet the government, which must have known that it was this nerve agent, otherwise we might as well disband Porton Down, the government must have known within a few hours what the agents was, and yet they let the public in Salisbury meander around the whole city while a very persistent nerve agent was at work.
Yeah.
This is not believable. This is absolutely not believable. So let's bring in the next bit. Mr. Skripal's car has already been taken away for examination by experts at the government's Porton Down Chemical Weapons Research Centre, along with the vehicle used to tow it from the, quote, Sainsbury's car park to a local car pound.
So hold on, let me understand this. They had a vehicle which they believed to potentially have residue of a chemical agent on it, biological agent on it.
Very persistent.
A very persistent biological agent in a Sainsbury's car park. So they thought the best thing to do was to hook it up to a tow vehicle and take it to the local car pound.
Yeah. Yeah, I've just got to correct you slightly. We're talking a chemical agent here.
Okay, chemical agent. So, but is there nobody in the
biological chemical? Yeah. Okay.
Is there nobody in the Telegraph that is looking at this and actually taking a step back and saying whether there's any credibility in what they're publishing at all?
Well, the interesting thing is how these stories are put together, and we had a little look at this. Now, I think this is the right man from the article. Philip Ingram is the name mentioned, freelance journalist, focus security, intelligence, terrorism, geopolitics, and former senior intelligence and security officer. So let's see what he had to say. Using the car would explain why both Mr. Skripal and his daughter got a dose at the same time and then transferred it around the restaurant and the pub. It's easy to break into a car and put some of the substance in there. They then jump into the car to go to the restaurant and pub and get contaminated in the process. This nerve agent, Novichok, would have taken effect in hours at most to work rather than days. So somebody breaks into a car with a highly toxic substance. Didn't they need to wear some sort of protection to do that? Shouldn't they have had a breathing mask on? Wouldn't they have needed a biological and chemical protection suit on? How do you put this absolutely devastating nerve agent in a car without protecting yourself while you do it?
That's a very good question.
It's a mystery, isn't it? It's a complete mystery. So somebody broke into the car, dumped this thing, which is so toxic, it's not even minute. We're talking about millionths of a gram. Somebody will correct me on that, but minuscule amounts will do the damage to kill somebody. But
maybe they just closed the door very quickly, Brian.
They closed the door very quickly.
Yeah.
Okay. So I had a look at this gentleman's Twitter page, and very interesting because he's got he's put out a retweet to the New York Times. Russia now has more intelligent agents deployed in London than at the height of the Cold War. Their main task, keep an eye on the hundreds of heavyweight Russians who've built lives in the UK. Well, this is very interesting. Why didn't our security services warn the public of this?
Yes.
And what does a heavyweight Russian mean? Does it mean a criminal Russian? Does it mean a gangster? I don't know. But it needed the New York Times. Then we've got this very interesting one. This is Hamish DBG, Novichok's. Russia has not destroyed its chemical weapons as declared to the UN. OPCW must investigate as soon as possible. British military needs capability to combat this threat. So if we're to believe this man, Hamish, he's now telling us that we had no idea what this stuff was, but Porton Down has now established what it was in a few days. So that was pretty clever.
Yeah.
But the British military had no idea this stuff existed. Well, we might as well disband the military, Mike.
Yes. And
let's bring in another one. He's got this one, Hamish DBG, Novichok in Salisbury, 0740. OPCW must investigate as soon as possible. Boycott and run in UK. That would really hurt Russia. So now we're helping to promote the threats against the Russians, but we haven't actually got the evidence it was the Russians. So who was Hamish? I was fascinated. This is Hamish. You can find his Twitter page. CBRN expert, Avon Protection Systems, and Director Doctors Under Fire, and CBRN, that's Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear, I think, to UOSSM in Syria. So it's just fascinating. The little trail of people lead back to Syria, where, of course, we've had exactly the same accusations that chemical weapons have been used with no proof whatsoever against the Assad regime or the Russians. So back to the story. This is the other man that they used. This is Jerry Smith. He describes himself as a thought leader focusing on security, resilience and capability development, which he calls change management, and he's formerly a member of the OPCW. He says the Novichok agent is very persistent and could linger for a reasonable length of time. So this is where
that's not defined.
No, that's not defined.
Right.
To be honest, there's very little knowledge in the open source about these agents. There is sort of 6 or 7 elements that the whistleblower put out of certain lightweight detail, shall we say, not a huge amount of detail. So this gets more mysterious because the whistleblower isn't really talked about at all. We've somebody talking about a whistleblower. Is that a government whistleblower or a Porton Down whistleblower? I don't know. But he says we do know that they can be, as you mentioned, binary. We do know that they can be very persistent. In fact, they can actually be micro-pulverized dust, so they're called dusty agents rather than being a liquid, so they hang around on surfaces for a reasonable length of time. Well, if the British government knew that, its action in Salisbury, I think is grossly negligent, and we should be looking at a massive action here by local people who've clearly been put at risk over the last few days by the British government.
Perhaps we need a public inquiry.
More than a public inquiry, I think we need the media to focus on this. The agent could have been made by other advanced countries. Now that statement, where do you think that statement was in the Telegraph article?
At the bottom.
The last sentence. The last sentence.
Yeah.
So there we have it. The police and the military are now going around putting little tents over car parking machines because they might have a dusty agent on them. But according to the British government, don't worry, go home and wash your clothes. And if they're dry cleaning articles, double bag them. So if we put part of this into context, let's remember that yesterday we reported that several newspapers had picked up on the fact that since Theresa May had taken over the Conservative Party, 3 million in Russian donations had come in. So that's all pretty handy. We don't know who those people are, but that money's helping now to run British political policy. Now, in the middle of this, of course, we've got our security service, MI5, and we've got MI6. Did they warn us that we had foreign nationals taking over the political agenda? If it happens in America with Trump, it's over the worldwide media. But if we've got Russian power base affecting British politics, nobody wants to talk about it. Remarkable. So silence from the British security services. Either they didn't know or they don't want to talk about it. Let's also remember that it's those same intelligence services that didn't want to talk about child abuse at political levels, or they lost the files as required, even though we've got former Conservative Party whips openly admitting they used child abuse to blackmail Conservative MPs to do their bidding. But the Secret Services, Mike, didn't know anything about it. They got a budget of multi-billions of pounds, but they didn't know any of this was going on.
No.
Sad, isn't it? So they didn't know about the child stealing, trafficking, the abuse and the murder. We say that's the engine of this political power and it's the fuel of the blackmail. So it's getting pretty easy to see that we're in a very dirty pond here. Same security services were implicated in the lies of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
Thinking back on it, they had a lot more actual evidence to present. It was all lies, but they presented evidence than there is today.
Yeah, they were brave enough to step up and put something on the table.
Yes.
We later discover it was a pack of lies, but at least they tried to put, quote, evidence forward. Now they don't put any evidence forward, they just make the accusations. It's probably safer that way.
Indeed.
Plausible deniability. And then we've got this persistent dust over car parking ticket machines, but they failed to detect any of this crime coming. They didn't know anything about the people, but we can go around putting these pretty little tents up. It's great, isn't it? So what's at the back of it? Well, let's remember the accusations against Ted Heath and the good work of Chief Policeman Mike Veal investigating Ted Heath. All of the information UK Column receives is that Ted Heath was involved in the abuse of children, and that is indeed what Mike Veal has put into the so-called independent inquiry. What does this mean? It means that Britain had a Prime Minister who took us on a pack of lies into the European Union project, but he was abusing children. So presumably, Mike, he was blackmailed at the same time.
Possibly, yes. What's next?
Well, let's bring in this one to end that section, because the Independent's reporting that Philip Hammond has insisted the Tories will not pay back more than 800,000 in donations from Russian oligarchs. So there we go.
Good stuff.
And just so that people know that this is all true about the children, in Scotland, they've been examining 200,000 old case records, and they've suddenly decided that maybe they've got another 20 child abuse victims there. So, sorry, there we go. We'll just give a quick advert for our NHS conference on the 12th of May, Dying for Good Health. This is going to be a very, very special event. You can find details here on the website. This will be a completely new range of speakers, specialists in their area on the NHS. And this is going to be the first of its kind, the first conference in its kind in UK, with professional people taking the lid off what is really happening in the UK as Theresa May's Conservative government try and finalise the privatisation programme.
Yes.
And this is quite interesting, Mike, because we've got ministers now starting to talk about how to get more cash into the NHS. And I presume this is because they're desperately worried that the general truth about the collapse of the NHS is coming up to the surface.
Okay, now, a week or so ago, Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Digital Media, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, was speaking in the House of Commons and expressing concern about the state of Britain's media, and particularly the potential or the risk that there are to on a commercial level to Britain's media. This is the mainstream media he was talking about. And he was speaking at the Oxford Media Convention 2018 yesterday. Well, what was he saying? Let's just have a look at that. He said, the first area I want to look into is accuracy, where we're seeing real threats to our media, to our society as a whole, is disinformation, also known as fake news. He said that, now let us not pretend that journalism has always been an error-free business. News is fast-paced, it makes mistakes sometimes as stories change and new facts emerge. We all know the strapline for over-enthusiastic journalists is not wrong for long. But there's a difference, he said, between making a mistake under the pressure of a deadline and deliberate disinformation designed to disrupt. We know that some of the problem is state-sponsored. Russia, for instance, persistently deploys its state-run media organizations to manipulate democratic institutions. And he said that a recent MIT study showed that falsehoods are 70% more likely to be retweeted than stories verified by fact-checking authorities. Fact-checking authorities, right, okay. He went on to say, clicks of course mean money, and so there are financial incentives to publish sensational stories with little regard for their accuracy. But he said it's no good just complaining about it, we must act. He said that the BBC is our best bulwark against fake news, and I celebrate its role in public life. Objective reality exists, he said. Journalists' jobs, as defined it and tell it, have confidence, broadcasters. Your country needs you, apparently. I welcome recent moves by Facebook and Google to use technology to prevent the spread of fake news online through algorithms to promote trusted news rather than dubious sources. Trusted news, trusted by whom? He didn't say.
Well, we know that 83% of the public don't trust the BBC. Mike, because of that poll result which the Daily Mail published, 83% of Britons do not trust the BBC.
Absolutely. He went on to say part of the solution also lies in education. And as Bertrand Russell said, get the patient young enough, you can tell them that snow is black and they'll believe you. Our schools and our curriculum, Matt Hancock said, have a valuable role to play so students can tell fact from fiction and think critically about the news that they need to watch. So this is all great stuff. He went on to complain about the lack of regulation on the internet. He said, take for example 3 different organisations posting a video online. If a broadcaster published it on their on-demand service, the content would be a matter for Ofcom. If a newspaper posted it, it would be a matter for Ipso. If an individual posted it online, it would be untouched by media regulation. Now, I'm passionate in my belief, he said, in a free and open internet, but freedom does not mean freedom to harm others. Freedom can only exist within a framework. It's not freedom then, Brian?
No, this is not freedom, Mike, because the British government feels that it has to control free speech. This in other countries would be known as a dictatorship. That's actually what it is, but at the moment they're pretending it's not. So they're having to come to the surface because the truth over the wider internet, facts and truth, information put out, UK column is certainly amongst that, is damaging these people. So Hancock says, no, the only thing to trust is the BBC or the government, and the government is going to define the framework of truth.
Well, it gets better. He said digital platforms need to step up and play their part in establishing online rules and working for the benefit of the public that uses them. And then he said, this brings me on to sustainability, the second lens for the future. The internet has been an immense force of good connecting people around the world, and in so doing it has turned the established order on its head and raised real questions about the sustainability of high quality journalism. I tremble at the thought, he said, of a media regulated by the state in a time of malevolent forces in politics. Get this wrong and I fear for the future of our liberal democracy. We must get it right. These are inspiring words, Brian. I'm inspired by them. How is he going to get it right? Well, he announced the Cairncross Review. So the Cairncross Review, the review will be led by Dame Frances Cairncross. Frances will bring her expertise as a journalist in business and in academia to bear on the thorny and complex questions at the heart of press sustainability. There are going to be a number of panelists. This is basically Leveson part 2, but as he said in his speech in the Commons last week, they're changing the terms of reference for the next inquiry. Panelists will include Peter Wright, a former editor at the Mail on Sunday, Polly Curtis, Editor-in-Chief at the Huffington Post, Geraldine Allinson, who's chair of the KM Media Group, and it's going to take a clear-eyed view, he says, of how the press is faring in the new world. It's going to explore where innovation is working well, and it's going to explore whether intervention may be required to safeguard the future of our free and independent press. Correct me if I'm wrong, if there's government intervention, which inevitably is going to be financial intervention, to safeguard the future of the press, it's going to be anything but free and independent. And he said the review will take evidence, report and publish recommendations within a year. We're confident that we'll find the solutions that can help both the industry and the government tackle these issues. This is not about government regulating the media, nor is it about propping up old business models that have stopped being viable. Rather, it's about making sure that we don't wake up in 5 years' time and find that high quality journalism has been decimated and our democracy damaged as a result.
That's quite a statement, Mike. This is not about the government regulating the media, but it absolutely is about the government. The government is stepping in to tell the media how to do their job. Apparently the media who are out there facing the marketplace, feeling the pressures of whether they can sell newspapers or not due to all sorts of other new information streams online, those media companies, those editors don't know their job, and they need this pipsqueak MP to stand up and say the government is going to tell you how to do the job. That's my first comment. The second comment is how were these Cairncross committee people selected and appointed? I don't know whether you do at this stage, but we'll have a look into that because I'm always fascinated by how the government creates a democratic process. But when you go behind it, the government has selected and appointed the people. Presumably they're going to return a statement, which is the one the government wants.
It's amusing to note that as I was reading through that, most of the criticism that Matthew Hancock has for the alternative media, having clickbaity headlines, false headlines, fake news, this absolutely applies to the mainstream media. And so it can be no better time to have another media on trial event. This is From Stop War running this. Again, this one is in Leeds in May the 27th. Details on mediaontrial.uk. Do get along to that if you possibly can. And let's, while we're advertising events, remind everybody of AV9 between the 4th and the 7th of May, Horwood House Hotel near Milton Keynes. Brian will be speaking at that. Patrick Henningsen will be speaking at it. Alex Thompson will be speaking at it. A whole host of other hugely interesting speakers. Do get along to that one if you possibly can as well.
And I'll just add, this is humanity on the cusp, but the cusp of what? Are we waking up, or are we descending into some really unpleasant super state? So that is the overall topic for speakers. I think it's going to be fascinating to see how the individual speakers tackle that subject and what their individual views are.
Now, let's have a look at this. This little video clip was pushed out by the government this morning. 1 in 7 people will be over 75 by 2040, it says. Well, it's showing pictures of older people. We're investing £98 million. That's fantastic. What are they investing it in? To help us live better for longer, they say.
That's not the reports that are coming into the UK column, Mike.
And what is this all about? It is the government's industrial strategy. So elderly people, Brian, are forming the backbone of Britain's industrial strategy. We're not going to build ships. We're not going to build aircraft. We're not going to build trains. We're not going to build anything physical. We're going to look after old people. So elderly care is now industrial in nature. This does not give me a warm feeling that is how the government views elderly people.
Yeah, well, I've got to say, Mike, that over the last year, probably 18 months, we've had more and more harrowing information coming into the UK about what is happening to elderly people in some care and residential homes. But the overall thrust that's coming through is that elderly people are being disposed of and their assets stolen. I think more of this will come to the surface. Possibly some of that will come into the NHS conference, but there's a lot of waking up to be done. Well, if we're on the subject of a dictatorship, let's have a look at this little story. It was the Daily Mail saying that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs claims 300,000 in tax on a UKIP donation by arguing it's, quote, not a proper party. So I've put in a couple of the other parts of the article. The current Treasury definition of a political party is one that has secured at least 150,000 votes and has 1 or 2 MPs elected to the Commons in a general election. Now, I'm fascinated by this because I didn't realise there was a Treasury definition of a political party, and I'm fascinated to see that the Treasury is telling the nation how it is going to form political parties. While UKIP, the article said, while UKIP has indeed had 3 MPs, Bob Spink, Douglas Carswell and Mark Reckless, all have been defectors from the Tory party, so UKIP has never been able to boast an MP who was elected at a general election. The current Treasury definition, oh sorry, I've got that in twice, I beg your pardon. My goodness, that's that would, I do apologise, I won't even go there. So what did Aaron Banks have to say? Well, first of all, the article says that HMRC sent a team of 5 barristers to do battle with him. He's come out fighting, arguing that UKIP won the European elections in 2014 with 27.5% of the vote, producing 23 MEPs. Presumably because they're MEPs, that didn't count with the Treasury. But the final comment he makes is, I think it'll come as a shock, not just to Nigel Farage, who led UKIP, but to the millions of people who voted for UKIP, that they were not voting for a political party. What a point to end our news today, because there's the statement that we had all those people who voted to come out of the European Union. Of course, many of those were loyal to UKIP. We've got a Conservative Party running the country on a minuscule vote. And where is the bulk of their funding coming from? Russian oligarchs. I think it's pretty easy to see that UK is a nation on its head at the moment, and there needs to be a long, hard look at the people that we have mistakenly allowed to come into power in UK, mistakenly allowed to lead the nation. It's up to us. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll just say, if you're watching UK Column and you're enjoying it, you're learning from UK Column, and you're not a subscriber, please consider taking a subscription and or making a donation, as we can only continue to do this with your financial support. And I have a feeling we're going to need more financial support in the coming weeks and months as the British government starts to censor more and more free media. We'll leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.